The humble seatbelt. As a safety device, it's simply to hold you in place during an accident so you don't bounce around the inside of a car like a ball in a pinball machine. But have you ever stopped to really consider it, how beautifully complex it is, but seemingly simple? And the fact that the seatbelt as we know it did not exist for the first 75 years of the automobile's history. And then it was another 20 or so years before it started to be made mandatory. To put it another way, the most common safety device we have that's affordable and simple didn't exist for nearly half the history of the car. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. If you're new here, I am John, and this is a far too brief but still interesting history of the seatbelt. The first primitive seatbelts were invented by the English engineer Sir George Cayley in the early 1800s. Largely considered the first aeronautical engineer, he was a prodigious inventor, developing self-righting lifeboats, caterpillar tractors, automatic signals for railways. He worked on internal combustion engines and invented wire wheels. He also created the first successfully manned glider and a lap belt to keep the pilot in place. His first test flight crashed, but the pilot survived. By 1928, all aircraft were required to have belts. In 1885, a New York City resident named Edward J. Claghorn received the first U.S. patent for a seatbelt for use in taxis. Looking more like a climbing harness where the rider would be hooked into the seat, it was understandably not popular. Barry Oldfield was an early pioneer in the new sport of auto racing, making a name for himself and his sponsor Henry Ford in 1902 by beating what was considered the world's fastest car, the Winton Bullet, by a half-mile over a 5-mile race. In 1903, he was the first to drive on a track faster than 1 mile a minute, and in 1910 set the world speed record of over 131 miles per hour. By 1914, he was racing in the Indy 500, and in 1916 became the first person to turn a 100-mile-an-hour lap in a front-wheel drive Christie. Through his career, he'd seen drivers die after being thrown from their cars in an accident, so in 1922, he bought a parachute harness and jerry-rigged his own seatbelt. It didn't catch on, as many still believed it was safer to be thrown clear of a crash than to be crushed, a myth that continued well into the 1980s. In 1949, Nash offered seatbelts in 40,000 cars, but buyers requested that they be removed, and it's estimated only 1,000 buyers actually ever used them. Research at the time showed belts' value, but opposition continued to point out that they could trap occupants and their rigid placement at internal organs could cause significant injuries. These points weren't helped by the design trends of the industry at the time, with hard interior surfaces and sharp points, none of which were mitigated without shoulder belts holding drivers' torsos in place, and which were made famous in Ralph Nader's 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed. In the 1950s, neurologist C. Hunter Sheldon saw hundreds of head injuries in the emergency room from auto accidents and investigated the design features that caused them. In 1955, he published an article in the November 5th edition of the Journal of the American Medical Association and proposed features such as retractable seatbelts, recessed steering wheels, reinforced roofs, roll bars, automatic door locks, and passive restraints such as airbags. For the 1956 model year, Ford offered the Lifeguard option package on full-sized Fords, which included seatbelts, part of an initiative driven by rising executive and future Ford president Robert McNamara. It was found that only 2% of buyers would actually pay for them. In 1958, Glenn Sharon was awarded a patent on a seatbelt that attached to the door and helped prevent kinks. But the first 3-point seatbelt was patented in 1955 by Americans Roger Griswold and Hugh DeHaven, a World War I pilot who survived a plane crash and who, after a traffic accident in 1933, had led him to experimenting with crash testing. Note that the buckle is in the middle. By 1958, Saab introduced lap belts as standard equipment on the Saab GT750. Swedish electric utility Vattenfall decided to do a study on the job accidents and found that the majority occurred when on the road with company business. 2 of their engineers began work and shared their results with Volvo in the late 1950s. Niels Bolin was a Swedish engineer with Saab's aircraft division working on ejection seats, and in 1958 he joined Volvo and set to work on a 3-point safety belt. After reviewing several designs, he received a patent in 1962 for one with the buckle now to the side. He once said, quote, "The pilots I worked with in the aerospace industry were willing to put on almost anything to keep them safe in the case of a crash, but regular people in cars don't want to be uncomfortable, even for a minute." The breakthrough with this design was the anchor point by the hip to hold the occupant in place, one continuous strap, and the ability to be put on with one hand quickly. The new belt was used in the 1959 Volvo PV544, and famously, Volvo later gave the patent away for free for the industry to use. In 1967, Bolin presented a paper where he had studied 28,000 accidents in Sweden, and that occupants using his three-point belts had zero fatal injuries in accidents below 60 miles an hour. In the U.S. in 1961, Wisconsin became the first state to require seatbelts in the front seats for all models built after 1962, but no accompanying requirement that passengers actually use them. By 1966, Congress passed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, leading to the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards and setting basic safety requirements across the entire nation. Taking effect in 1968, Standard 208 required lap or lap and shoulder belts for each front seating position, as well as headrests, energy-absorbing steering wheels, and shatter-resistant windshields. While the changes had a measurable effect by 1970, seatbelt usage was still voluntary, and federal law left it up to the states. Worldwide, the first mandatory seatbelt law came into effect in 1970 in Victoria, Australia, and it wasn't until 1984 that New York became the first U.S. state to require occupants to buckle up. Today, every state has a law requiring adults to wear seatbelts except for New Hampshire, but laws vary wildly from state to state regarding what ages or seat locations are required to wear belts, and whether it's a primary offense or can only be cited after being pulled over for another reason. Much like DUI laws in the U.S., these seatbelt laws drew criticism as an infringement on personal rights in your own vehicle, including claims that it was like communism.
Pretty soon we're going to be a communist country.
In 1973, an emergency locking retractor was mandated, allowing some normal freedom of movement but locking before a crash. It also required an interlock to be installed, preventing the car from being started until the driver's belt was buckled. Public outrage spurred Congress to cancel that law the next year. In 1977, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation mandated that every new car should have passive restraints that worked without user input. The options were either airbags or automatic seatbelts, and they would be required by 1982. After Reagan's election and his promises of deregulation,
the American consumer is being hurt by government regulations that actually contribute to higher gas bills. We want to change that.
The requirement was dropped in 1981, but in an interesting historical twist, insurance companies sued, demanding the mandate be implemented. The case went to the Supreme Court, where they ruled unanimously that the DOT had to reinstate the requirement. Thus, a new rule was introduced in 1984, phasing in passive restraints between 1987 and 1990, requiring those hated motorized shoulder belts or manual belts with an airbag. Chrysler became the first U.S. automaker to use a driver's side airbag standard on 6 models. After 1998, driver and passenger side airbags became mandatory. In 1989, safety standards required all outboard seating positions to have 3-point belts. In 1993, North Carolina began the Click It or Ticket campaign, pushing for greater seatbelt usage, and it was so effective it became a national program of the NHTSA in 2003. In 2012, the Popular Science article noted statistics that the 1 of 8 Americans who don't wear seatbelts account for 2/3 of all fatal accidents. By 2024, the nationwide usage was up to 91.2. The modern seatbelt is a miracle of engineering, and it is estimated that seatbelt usage has saved over 1 million lives worldwide. Locking retractors allow just a little bit of movement in the belt. Explosive pretensioners work with your airbag sensors to take up slack before an accident and hold you firmly against the seat. And the belt itself is a polyester designed with a slight amount of stretch in a herringbone twill weave, helping to moderately cushion you against the forces being imparted on your body. I remember the laws requiring front seat occupants to wear seat belts and discussions with my friends as a teenager that the government shouldn't be able to tell us what to do in our own vehicles. It's safer to be thrown clear. You don't want to be trapped in a vehicle, unable to get out if you happen to be sinking into a pond or if the car happens to be on fire, and just how uncomfortable seat belts were. Of course, I was young and stupid. Statistics don't lie. Wearing a seatbelt is the single best thing you can do to increase your chances of survival in an accident. However, today, I feel vulnerable if I don't click into my seatbelt and consider those who do avoid it to be winning the Darwin Award of the day. Before there were arguments and ranting about face masks and COVID, there were protests against seatbelt, and it's both sad and shocking to look back at how long it took for such a basic, simple, and inexpensive piece of safety equipment to be adopted, not only by the industry, but by the public at large. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks to my patrons who help support and make videos like this possible. And on those occasions where I'm ahead of schedule, enjoy early releases ad-free of these videos. Be sure to check out my second channel, All Cars Reacts, where I do news, opinions, reactions, and generally vlog about my opinions on the automotive industry. And in the future, I'm going to be breaking down this seatbelt and showing you exactly the mechanisms on how they work inside of it. So stay tuned for that. And thanks so much for spending just a few minutes with me here today.